Hello and welcome to this live and exclusive Female Coaching Network webinar. My name is Louise Capicotto and I'm the presenter for this evening's webinar, as well as being an FCN Academy coach. First of all, I would like to say thank you all for joining us. We have coaches joining us from Europe, the UK, USA and Canada. So good morning, good afternoon or good evening wherever you are in the world. Okay, so a bit about me. I'm a BPS Chartered Sport and Exercise Psychology in training with Loughborough Sport. It's not on the slide, but I just started as an assistant academy sports psychologist at Leicester City Football Club. I'm a powerlifter and a thrower. I'm a female coaching network academy coach, England Athletics coaching assistant, mainly with the throwing events. I'm an assistant coach to the Loughborough University weightlifting team. And I'm a BEAT ambassador. If you don't know what BEAT is, it's the UK eating disorder charity. So the aims of the webinar are, I'm going to give you an introduction about eating disorders in sport. I'll be sharing my own experience of eating disorders. I'll be telling you the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders, identifying symptoms, effects of performance, risk factors, sport-specific pressures, the treatment challenges for athletes specific to the UK, and I'll give you some tips about what coaches can do to support the athletes, along with takeaway messages and Q&A, if you have any questions for me. If you have questions, would it be okay to keep them to the end so that I can dedicate that time to answer them? So, introduction. Athletes are often viewed as healthy. However, the eating behaviours of some athletes may be associated with disordered eating or an eating disorder. I think eating disorders in sport is considered the last taboo within applied sports psychology. Hopefully I will tackle some misconceptions in this webinar as well. Coaches and support staff are in a great position to identify disordered eating and eating disorders and are an important source of support. There is a need for sport-specific support and treatment, especially regarding exercise. Okay, so there's a bit here sharing my own experience. Sport was always a safe haven for me from a young age. I would go to school early to do sport, come home late. Yeah, just sport was my life. But from the age of 16, I was diagnosed with the clinical eating disorder anorexia nervosa. My BMI dropped severely low and I suffer from osteopenia, and if you don't know what that is, it's thinning of the bones and it's the stage before osteoporosis. I diagnosed with bulimia and depression at age 18 and I had to have long-term inpatient treatment stays, which caused me to drop out of university as well. The cardiac arrest was from a low potassium, which is a common sign with bulimia. And it was only when I was 25 when I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is often termed developmental trauma. That took 10 years to really get to the core issue. And I still experience long-term complications from this. So if you follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you might have seen a post that I tweeted about the long-term effects that I still suffer from. So some of these were permanent damage to my heart. My left ventricle and left atrium are thin. The muscle is very thin. I've got permanent damage to my digestive system as well, and I'm constantly cold and tired, so that affects me as an athlete. I put there in bold, however, athletes with eating disorders can manage and overcome issues with appropriate support, and I think that's an important thing to get across, that athletes don't have to suffer for their whole life. So to start with, the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. I think sometimes they're used interchangeably, and I think that it's important to distinguish between the two because it has implications for treatment. So disordered eating refers to a wide range of abnormal eating behaviours, many of which are shared with diagnosed eating disorders, but they're at a subclinical level. Eating disorders are psychological disorders that involve extreme disturbances in eating behaviour. And the most commonly researched ones are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder, which I'll go into more detail in the next slides. So the main thing differentiating these two are the level of severity of the symptoms and the frequency of the behaviours. So this is the continuum of eating disturbance, which I really like. On the left-hand side, there's the healthy attitudes and behaviours around eating and exercise. In the middle, as you slide along, it's disordered eating, so it's subclinical issues. And on the far right, there's clinical issues with the eating disorders. And you can see there along the continuum where the different behaviours lie. And I think with eating disorders, an athlete doesn't one day eat normally and then the next wake up with an eating disorder. There's the period in the middle where their eating and exercise becomes disordered. And I think that is the area where people working in sport, such as coaches, sports psychologists, S&C coaches, physios, can have a big impact. Because if we intervene there, they're less likely to continue sliding down on the right towards clinical issues. So I think that is a great diagram. So that's why I've included it. So clinical eating disorder symptoms. So I'll give you a few minutes to maybe look through these. They're just the same as the symptoms that you would see in the clinical population, the general population, sorry. So anorexia nervosa, I'm sure some of you have heard of these before. An intense fear of gaining weight, the thinning hair and hair loss, lanugo, if you don't know what that is, that fine downy hair that grows on your arms and your lower back, sometimes the face as well. And it's mainly to help keep your body temperature higher because you've got little body fat. So bulimia, frequent bathroom trips after eating, that's for self-induced vomiting. Preferring to eat alone in secret. Laxative abuse as well. And binge eating disorder. I think this is talked about less in sport. I think there's a large focus on the anorexia and the bulimia. But I know there was an American footballer that came out on Twitter, I think last year. I can't remember his name, but he was a good example. Hiding empty food containers, frequent dieting without weight loss, lack of control once beginning to eat. So just to give you an idea of what the symptoms and what to look for. If you want a copy of that particular slide, I can always send it out, or I can get Vicky to send it out. Okay, so identifying the subclinical disordered eating symptoms in athletes. So they engage in excessive exercise beyond the training program, inability to take rest days without feeling guilty, skipping meals, unhealthy attitudes around food. So it's very, very similar to the symptoms on the previous slide, except these would be of a lower severity and more sporadic. So perhaps you wouldn't see them in every training session. So they might turn up one session feeling extremely tired, however the next feeling really energetic. So that's why disordered eating can be quite difficult to acknowledge or observe. So for me, I think I hid the disordered eating quite well before it became a clinical issue. When I was diagnosed, I didn't know what anorexia was. I knew that I didn't want to eat, not related to my performance. I didn't want to lose weight I wasn't a runner, I threw javelin. I just didn't, I'd lost my appetite. But I felt the cold a lot more, and I originally went to the doctor thinking that I had Raynaud's disease, which is where I think most people know, where you get really cold fingers and toes. It was only when he weighed me that I was underweight. So there are probably other signs, but nobody really picked up on them. So next slide. So what are some of the risk factors for why an athlete develops disordered eating or an eating disorder? So the three main categories. The first is genetic vulnerability. So there's some evidence that suggests eating disorders can have a genetic basis. However, the biological causes of eating disorders are still not fully understood. I think there's been some studies with twins where both twins have developed a clinical eating disorder, but we don't know whether that's down to genetics or the fact that they're experiencing the same environment growing up, or it can be a combination of both. I think that there's a higher risk for a young, not just an athlete, a young person to develop an eating disorder if their mother or father has also experienced disordered eating or an eating disorder. So I think that's quite an interesting fact. The second is psychological factors. So behaviours and personality characteristics that can place a person at a greater risk of adopting disordered eating habits. I think with athletes in particular, there's a very high perfectionistic tendencies. They can be quite obsessive, even neurotic at times. Harm avoidance or traits such as excessive worrying or fear. Trauma there as well. So in the general population, there's been some research about how if you had experience of sexual abuse or emotional abuse or physical abuse, that it can increase an individual's risk to developing a clinical eating disorder. So that would obviously be the same in a sporting population. So thirdly, socio-cultural influences. So I suppose this would be where the body image and peer pressure would come in. So I think one misconception, I think, if you follow me on Twitter as well, I posted about body image being one of the big things that the media focused on about why athletes develop an eating disorder. And I think that initially it can start out as body image issue, so you become very self-conscious, especially in sports like gymnastics where your body is on show. But I think that alone doesn't make someone develop an eating disorder. I think it's a combination of those risk factors. So if you had 5 or 6 of these that an individual is experiencing, it puts them at a greater risk of developing an eating disorder. So the high pressure environment there for school, work or sport. I think if an athlete who wasn't an athlete, so say if you take them out of the sport, however they experienced a lot of stress in a different environment, such as at school, the eating disorder would still come out in that environment. So it's the same, I relate it to an addiction or alcohol addiction, that whatever stressful environment they're experiencing, they will use that as their coping mechanism. So sport is just another high pressure environment where an athlete is at risk of developing disordered eating and an eating disorder. So risk factors as well. I think this table here, I think it highlights well the problems with identifying what is disordered and what is healthy. So the same competitive personality traits and perfectionistic tendencies that make elite athletes successful are also factors that contribute to the development of the disorders. So a good athlete is committed to training, They want to pursue high levels of excellence. They perform despite feeling pain. However, these same qualities are what people with eating disorders will also experience and can contribute to the development of the illness. And I think it's knowing when these become an issue for the athlete, so whether their perfectionistic tendencies or their excessive exercise, whether that impacts on their ability to function on a daily basis. So for me, with the excessive exercise, I think at the beginning, I would go maybe 3 or 4 days a week to the gym, so that wasn't impacting on my daily life as much, until there was a point where I walked 2 hours to the gym. I would go on the cross trainer for 2 hours and then row off for 2 hours and then walk back home for 2 hours, and I would do that every single day. So obviously that was having a massive impact on my ability to function and my ability to concentrate on my schoolwork. So that was during the summer, before my GCSE exam. So yeah, so it's just realizing when these traits and these personality traits become an issue for the athlete. So the sport specific pressures, I think athletes, this is good for athletes because within the normal treatment for the general population with eating disorders, if an athlete goes to see a clinical psychologist via the NHS, I think very little is focused on the sport, because the clinical psychologist firstly cannot get access to the person's training environment, and secondly they might not have any prior experience or knowledge of sport. So I think this is a massive issue currently within UK sport. And part of my research last year was talking to sports psychologists on their experiences of supporting athletes with clinical eating disorders. And one of the things they found was an issue was communicating with clinical psychologists. There was massive barriers to communication between these two groups, and I think that impacted upon the recovery process for the athletes they were working with. So I think that I think where sports psychologists and coaches can come in here is if they can acknowledge the disordered eating before it becomes a clinical issue, maybe they can help prevent it from becoming clinical, if you see what I mean. So if I go through some of the sport specific pressures that coaches can hopefully reduce, there's higher prevalence in weight-based and athletic sports, but this does not mean that athletes in other sports do not also develop eating disorders. So it's not just gymnastics or ice skating, it's in any sport. So I was a javelin thrower, that's not a typical one that's researched for eating disorders, but it can be anyone. Just like in the general population, anyone can be affected. Teammates have been shown to be a source of weight pressure for athletes, particularly when noticing weight gain. So I think, did anyone, you'd have to type, but I think the interview with Bobby Clay, that was, I think that's from the BBC. What struck me from that was, with her lack of periods, she did not see that as an issue, because the other athletes within her training group, they were experiencing the same thing. So it wasn't an abnormal thing. It was normal to not get your period. So I think teammates do have a big part to play. I think there's more research in this last year. Hopefully there'll be more. The poor coach-athlete relationship. an unhealthy or ego-oriented training environment, so where there's a lot of comparisons between athletes within a training group, or comparisons between one athlete and someone who they probably haven't even met. So I think within athletics this is quite difficult, because that's what, well, your performance is based and compared to the power of 10. So it's very, very difficult to get away from this. A lack of healthy coping resources. So similar to an alcohol addiction or any other addiction, that the eating disorder can be something the athletes turn to if they don't know how to regulate their own emotions in a healthy way. They can come from following onset of an injury, another coping mechanism there, and transitions and uncertainty. So the transitions one was quite big for me when I went from being an under 15 athlete to moving up to the under 17s. That was the scariest thought for me. I would always win as an under 15. I think I went 4 years unbeaten, and I knew that there was a girl who was 1 year older than me, and she made a lot of progress in that 1 year. And when I moved up, I was going to be competing against her, and I think that alongside my GCSEs, there was a lot of pressure from there. Pressure from my parents to get good grades, pressure from the school to get good grades. I think all of that came together, and I didn't have anyone to talk to really. I think, before that time I hardly spoke to my coach. I was quite a quiet girl. I think someone described me as a selective mute at one point. I literally would not talk. So I think, like the previous slide showed, all the risk factors, I think when all of those do come together, that can increase the likelihood of someone developing an eating disorder. So retired female athlete paradox. This is a new research area, really. I don't think it's been in the media yet. It's by Capicotto et al. From Loughborough University. So he interviewed, I think, 10 female recently retired athletes from all different sports, and they perceived muscle loss during retirement from sport to be either one of two things. So when they retired from sport and there was increased fat, they became dissatisfied with this, and they ended up having eating behaviours that became disordered. So they went through their entire sporting career without disordered eating, and then they developed disordered eating when they retired from sport. So I think that this is an area that needs to be researched more. And then there was increased femininity, which they were very satisfied with. So I know that in strength sports, I think it was someone from CrossFit actually, that they liked the increased femininity. So they had these, I think this half had disordered eating during their athletic career, and it was only when they retired from sport did they manage to reduce the level of disordered eating. So I think this just shows that, one, like, there is an issue with disordered eating in sport, because if some managed to overcome the eating issues when they left the sport, there's something wrong with when athletes are in the sport. And I think it's around the transition away from being an athlete as well. So there's been research where it's linked to your whole sporting identity, your identity as a person. So when athletes retire from sport, not just females, males as well, it's kind of like, who am I now? If I don't have sport in my life, what do I do? So I know that it has been in the media about athletes becoming addicted to alcohol, or they have depression. So I think disordered eating or clinical eating disorder is just another thing that could happen to an athlete when they retire. I don't know if there's been any research for when males retire from sport around disordered eating, but hopefully there'll be more in the future. So why do athletes need treatment? So I think this links back to what I was speaking about, how coaches can intervene. I think it's previously been believed that only clinical psychologists or doctors or medical professionals can actually support someone with an eating disorder, whereas it's now changing. There's stuff coming out now about duty of care within sport, about how everyone has a responsibility and a role to play in supporting athletes. So if we look at the top there, athlete deteriorates psychologically without intervention. So that would be the period of disordered eating, or the beginning of a clinical eating disorder. So that there is where coaches in particular, because they are most likely to spend the most time with the athlete compared to an SC coach or a physio or sports psychologist, that they will notice the disordered behaviours more, and they can maybe help prevent it from sliding along that continuum to a clinical issue. So the performance decrements eventually occur. Poor performance increases the pressure on the athlete. Disorder becomes a way the athlete copes with the pressure. So we talk about the coping mechanism. As the symptoms worsen, athletes isolate from others. So they rely more on the coping mechanism rather than maybe what they used to do, talk to their friends or talk to their coach or talk to the parents. So it just becomes a vicious cycle that athletes may not be able to break. I think what I put there, the short-term performance versus the long-term health. So I think at the beginning of disordered eating or eating disorder, so you may lose some weight, and maybe for a distance runner, that could actually have a short-term benefit on performance. So you can run a bit faster because you're carrying a lighter body mass. However, it's either that the longer that goes on, you'll have long-term damage to your health. So it's weighing those two things up. So maybe in a weight class sport like powerlifting or weightlifting, you'll get a short-term performance improvement when you do, say if you have to lose 3 kilos overnight for every competition that you do, you might be able to make that weight and perform well, but in the long term, what is that doing to your body and your psychological health as well? Because if you're losing the weight in a very unhealthy way by taking laxatives or diuretics, then that is going to have an impact on your body. So the effects of disordered eating on sports performance. So I've included this slide here because I think it's quite a good way to maybe help an athlete realise that they do actually have an issue. I think at the beginning, athletes, they might not always come forward straight away and admit to having a problem. Then they may be quite defensive, and that's very normal, and that's expected. But there's something that similar in sports psychology, what we do, it's like having your training program and then you show them the training program, and it's meant to help with your confidence. So this is like having facts and proof to help them become more aware of what is actually happening. So the body is tremendously resilient, so athletes can sometimes perform well despite having a serious eating disorder, but eventually the athlete begins to suffer both physically and psychologically. So an inadequate carbohydrate intake, the early glycogen depletion and fatigue. So athletes may start off the session really well, but you might notice that they're unable to complete sessions all of a sudden, and there's no other reason for it. So inadequate protein intake, muscle weakness and wasting. Obviously there you might notice that they're obviously losing weight. What else is there? So DOMS as well, if they're experiencing a lot more muscle soreness than usual. Dehydration, increased fatigue, provocation with food, so they're a decrease in concentration levels. So if you have athletes that are studying for exams, that will be, if they're also experiencing disordered eating, that's going to have a massive impact on their performance in both their academics and their sport, because if in the background they're constantly thinking about food and weight and exercise, how can they possibly focus on sport or education? So VO2 max and running speed will decrease. Probably not at the, like I said, at the beginning, they will probably increase, but the longer it goes on, they will eventually decrease. And increased cortisol levels, so increased stress, and ultimately I think that will lead to more body fat storage, especially around the abdominal region. So potential complications. I guess this links with the relative energy deficiency in sport, and it builds upon the female athlete triad, which some of you may have heard of. And it's the energy deficiency gap that results when energy intake is insufficient to support growth, health, and healthy functioning. So increased risk of injury, especially fractures, reduced bone density. So like I was lucky that I didn't have any bone fractures, but yeah, I did have weakened bones, had osteopenia. And I think that my bones were the age of someone who was 70, and at the time I was 15. But luckily I had a load of calcium, a load of milk, and the actual weight-bearing activity of weightlifting has helped reduce that to, so I think now the age of mine is about 40, even though I'm 28. So it's a lot better. It just takes a lot of time. So menstrual irregularities. So this one, yeah. So I know it's probably a taboo subject. So if coaches don't have the conversation, or if parents don't have a conversation with an athlete about whether they're getting their periods regularly or not, that is an issue, because I think that is one of the main factors, I think, not in the DSM-5, in the DSM-4, what they used to clarify the eating disorders, anorexia, the lack of periods was one of the main criteria. I think that might have been changed now. I'll have to double check actually. So cardiovascular problems, so that you're feeling cold all the time, anemia as well, so you can get low red blood cells, and that would obviously affect your VO2 max and your ability to train as an athlete. Reduced immunity, that's a big one. Digestive problems, psychological impact, so low mood and feeling numb. And that one can actually be, I think that one was picked up by my coach before my parents and the doctor. He could see that I was coming more withdrawn, and I used to smile all the time, and I became quite a different person. I wasn't really enjoying the sport as much. I felt like I had to be there rather than I wanted to be there. And I think that the ability to feel numb from the illness can actually can be quite attractive to some people, not in a way that they would choose to restrict their eating for that reason, but it prolongs the illness because it's serving a purpose. So if they're if they're trying to avoid uncomfortable emotions, then avoiding eating, which numbs you from feeling those emotions, that can prolong the eating disorder and makes recovery a much longer process and more difficult. Relationship problems, so isolation. Yeah, so that was a big one for me. And I think that not just people in sport, just people in general, didn't really understand that. So I developed an eating disorder at age 15, and I'd say only in 2 years ago, so when I was 26, that I really overcame that. And I think when you have an eating disorder, it can take up so much of your time. So if you have bulimia, that was the one that I was hospitalised for. I would binge and purge about 7 times a day, and that would take an hour and a half for each. So obviously that would take up my whole day, and other than that, I'd be in bed because I'd be so exhausted. So that would impact upon the amount of time I would spend with friends or the amount of time I spend with my family. And I think that the more the illness becomes more clinical and you become more engrossed in it, the more you believe that you don't need your friends or your family anymore because you've got the illness and that's all you really need. So I think the relationship problems can, if you know someone who has had an eating disorder, they may well still have problems with relationships and any of the above in that the list of bullets there. Actually, I'll go back to that one. So I think this is an area of research that I'm looking to get more into because over the last few years I've been trying to find out more about the long-term implications for athletes that have gone through an eating disorder and have returned to sport, and what that would mean for their training and how coaches can support athletes who have returned from an eating disorder. And there's not much out there. So I know it's a very individualized process, but there's literally nothing. There's just nothing really to go on. I think you have to look up things for every single one of these problems and try and piece together what would help you. So I think for my coach, I think he was very confused about what would help me. He didn't know whether to put me on what type of training program for how long, how much rest I needed. We didn't really get that much help there, and I think the GP and my doctors didn't really understand sport, so they couldn't really have an input there. So yeah, I think more research is needed in that. Yeah, so treatment challenges for the UK. So Plateau et al. From Loughborough University explored the experiences of female athletes with eating disorders during treatment. And one of the things that was a major barrier was feeling out of place. So when they received treatment, it was more towards there was less about their athletic identity, which may have been a big issue for them. So like I said, when you retire from sport or you're injured, your sporting identity plays a massive role in prolonging the illness. So, but if that isn't identified or addressed in treatment, then it might make you feel that why are you there, because it's not targeting the main issue. So another one was coping with exercise transitions. So exercise is rarely addressed in treatment. So I remember when I was an inpatient, I was competing in powerlifting at this time, and I needed inpatient treatment for my bulimia, and I was there for 6 months, and we weren't allowed to do exercise at all. After every meal, we'd have to sit down for an hour. We weren't allowed to go outside for the first 3 weeks that we were there, and I found that incredibly difficult. Because as an athlete, I would like going out for walks. I would like going outside for therapeutic reasons, and I think it was always questioned that I only wanted to go for a walk to burn calories, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do. But yeah, so I think there is a need for athlete specific treatment in the UK, I think. I know in the US, I think, no, I can't remember the name of it. There is one program that they have inpatient treatment stays for athletes, and it's very specialised towards athletes, and I think that is great. I think eventually, hopefully, that would come to the UK. They have sports psychologists, clinical psychologists, medical doctors, physios, all on one site. And I don't know how much it is to attend there, but it's helped a lot of people. So yeah, eventually I think that is what is needed, but obviously it would come at a very high cost. For me, I found a clinical psychologist that actually helped get me inpatient treatment, and that was Dr. John Arkellis, and he's based in Leicestershire. So if anyone is having an issue with a current athlete and is looking for a clinical psychologist, I would definitely recommend him. I don't know how long you would have to wait to see him, but he can. I think for me it was only about 2 weeks, so he's definitely look him up on Google. So yeah, typical treatment relies on support from family. So I think that is another one that can be a problem for athletes. I think because I don't know for all athletes, but there's some athletes I know that don't have much contact with their family. So with normal treatment, if it's heavily reliant on your family and if they're not very supportive, then what do you do? I think it's on the next slide so where I've put there relies on support from family. I think that I've used the sport family as an example, where everyone in sport can have a role to play in supporting athletes with an eating disorder. So the sports psychologist, the doctor, coaches, sports nutritionist. I think that especially if they're having relationship issues and a lack of social support from their friends or the family, if they don't understand, I think there's sometimes when friends and family don't really understand an issue, they can back away from the athlete, and I think that that's really not really what they need. But I know it can be very uncomfortable to talk to them, but I think that one of the main messages from me for this would be to always say something, and don't let it go unnoticed. So I think one of the biggest barriers is just the stigma and just not bringing it up. Maybe because you don't think it's your place, but I think that if you're coaching, I think that the whole athlete, not just their sport performance, I think that's what you have to look after. I think that's what the duty of care thing coming out from, is it the EIS or UK Sport? I think that is a massive thing. So eating disorder as an injury. So in the US, eating disorders are viewed by the NCAA as an injury and needing athlete-specific treatment. So this relates back to the other slide. This has significantly encouraged help-seeking behaviours from athletes, because I think that knowing that the NCAA sees it as an injury and they're giving some time off that's allowed them to engage more in recovery, I think that they become less fearful of coming forward and telling someone that they think they have an issue. I think it's a good analogy as well to see it as an injury, because it affects you both physically and psychologically. So athletes with an eating disorder would experience similar difficulties to athletes with an injury. So they'll be mourning the temporary or permanent loss of sport. So I was fortunate enough to come back into sport after my eating disorder, but I am suffering the consequences at the moment. But at least I was able to return to sport. I think for some athletes, when they develop an eating disorder, they might not ever be able to return to sport. So I think that it depends how severe the illness was. So I think, yeah, the inability to compete, limited interaction with the training group, uncertainty around regaining prior level performance, patience and time are needed definitely. So I think what helped for me with the limited interaction with the training group, even though I wasn't allowed to join in with the training, I would still, like, my coach would still encourage me to come along to training sessions and take up a different role. So even if I was just measuring the throws in training practice, or yeah, like, I was getting more involved with coaching, and that passion for coaching is really why I still coach now. I don't know whether I would have ended up coaching if I didn't have the opportunity when I was ill and injured. So I think that's always, even for an athlete who doesn't have an eating disorder but has an injury, I think it's great to still encourage them to come along to training and still feel involved. So then they can still feel like they are part of the sport, and they want to return to sport as well. So when can an athlete return to training and sport? So this will be very individualised. It's not a clear-cut yes or no. It's not the same for everyone. They'll need medical clearance to return to training. So from their GP or the medical doctor, to saying that all their vital signs are okay, that their blood pressure's okay, their heart rate, their weight, the willingness to fuel for activity. So I think this is where education come in from coaches and parents, just to enable athletes to really understand why they need to fuel themselves properly. I think that I used to, well, this is only maybe 3 years ago, I used to always think of making sure I eat after I go to the gym to enable myself to recover and rebuild the muscle when it's been damaged in training. But now I try and think of fueling my gym session, so making sure I eat enough and drink enough before I go to the gym, because it allows me to perform better when I'm in the gym. So it's those little things that have helped me. I think that encouraging to eat before they train, it reduces the connection between allowing yourself to eat after you've done exercise, which can be an issue with disordered eating. So many would only allow themselves to eat if they've been to the gym for 2 hours. So, but if you try and encourage people to understand the need to eat before they train, then I think that is a more healthy message. Agree to be supervised. So I think if they are just returning to sport from an eating disorder, I think it's important to always look after them, and in case they do end up fainting, or it can be quite dangerous. Focus on good form and biomechanics rather than what they're necessarily doing. I think when you return to sport, it's like you have a whole new body. So it is just allowing them to really understand what their body is doing, how it acts, how it what it does. So I think it's just help them build awareness around that. Reduce the intensity and the frequency, obviously, compared to what they were training. And encourage use of RPE. So if some of you might already use this in your own training, it's the rate of perceived exertion. So it's scored out of 10. So 1 would be easy and 10 would be full effort and feeling really, really tired from the exercise. So aim for about 4 or 5. So it's medium intensity. So however, be aware of any complications that may impact their return to sport and future exercise, and do any sport factors that may have contributed to eating issues still exist. So if an issue was one of the risk factors, say was within the sport. So if there was an unhealthy training environment or unhealthy messages coming from the coach or other teammates, do they still exist? And if they do, that will be a big issue for one, the athlete who's returning to sport, but also the other people in the training group, because that could maybe encourage more disordered eating behaviours. So it's important to look not just at individual athlete behaviours, but the whole as a collective. This one, I've included the use of exercise in recovery. So I think that exercise can be viewed quite negatively when it comes to eating disorders. I think that some I haven't included the citations there, but exercise can be used as a motivation for athletes to want to engage more in recovery. So this was a big one for me as well, that I really wanted to get back into sport. The time away from sport made me realise that I missed it so much, and I really wanted to get back in. So knowing that if I kept myself well and I looked after myself, I was able to continue to compete in sport. So it can be a big motivation factor. This hasn't been shown in the general population. It's only actually been shown with athletes. So I think that's quite an important thing to realise here. So maybe it wouldn't be appropriate for the general population, because sport doesn't mean the same thing to them as it does to athletes. So however, if athletes, especially if they have bulimia or anorexia, that they do have issues with over exercising, I think that obviously this use of exercise it needs to be addressed. Like, why are they exercising? If they're exercising to burn calories, then that their whole beliefs around exercise needs to be addressed within therapy. So yoga, that I think they use that sometimes in inpatient treatment facilities, not all of them, but it helps encourage athletes to become more aware of their emotions and their feelings and their thoughts and just their body in general. So I think that is a good one. Resistance training, increased the bone density. Group sessions, a source of social support. And yeah, exercise can increase self-esteem as well. So I think the use of exercise, especially the resistance training, when say they're at a BMI that's around 17, 18, that's close to normal, it can also benefit when they're restoring weight. So they're not just gaining fat, they're also gaining muscle, which can help with their overall self-confidence, I think, when they're returning to sport as well. So what can coaches do? If you're concerned, say something. I think try and address athletes privately, not in a group, because they probably won't be willing to share it. So yeah, take them aside, be willing to listen, read and learn more about disordered eating and eating disorders, such as the early warning signs and what to look for specifically in athletes. So like I said, they may be feeling cold all the time, quite withdrawn, feeling a lot more fatigued. So educate athletes, other coaches and parents on the importance of eating enough, especially during periods of intense training. Build a professional support network, so a clinical psychologist, physios, sports nutritionists that you can rely upon and you think that the athlete will get along with. Be careful with language, so address the individual as opposed to addressing the illness. I think there can be a tendency to want to say the anorexic girl, or rather than the actual athlete's name. I think that the athlete will probably pick up on that. If athletes are required to lose weight, seek support from a sports nutritionist and monitor carefully. So this is more weight class sports, so weightlifting, powerlifting, boxing. And if an athlete has an eating disorder, try and keep them engaged. So encourage them to come along to training so they don't become even more withdrawn and isolated. encourage an autonomy supportive training environment. So instead of always focusing on the comparisons and their performance only, try and encourage them to just be more focused on the process of their technique and how they're developing in comparison to themselves rather than in comparison to others. Balance challenge and support, encourage a healthy mastery oriented environment, so that's similar to the autonomy supportive one, and encourage help seeking behaviours. I put check-in, the coach athlete relationship in brackets, and checking in. So I think at the beginning or the end of a session is a great time to just check in with each athlete and see how their week's going, and just to try and know a bit more about them, so you know what's normal for them or what's abnormal. Just, know the athletes a bit better, really. Encourage athletes to widen their sense of identity, which they can draw upon for their self-esteem. So there's an exercise here, how much of the pie does sport occupy? So you get the athlete to draw a circle and split the pie into different proportions of what each area of their life feels. So when I was younger, sport would probably take up maybe 90%, and the rest 10% would probably school. And that obviously, when sport was taken away, I didn't have much left. So ideally, you want friends, family, sport, different activities in there, some music, just so if sport is taken away, they have other areas to draw upon. Encourage self-awareness, so athletes can keep diaries for identifying any triggers. If there's any patterns that trigger their disordered thoughts or feelings, then I think if you can identify those, then you have somewhere to start from. Because if you do write just a list of triggers, and they're all kind of sporadic, like where do you actually start? So I think if you try and find any patterns, then that's a good way to actually target the behaviours and the thoughts. So suggest mindfulness, headspace there. I don't know if any use it already. It's just a daily, I think it's 10 to 15 minutes a day. I think it's great. I think you can get it on Android and for iPhone. So great app. Limit comparisons in any context. I think that's similar to what I said before about focusing on the process rather than comparing to others. So what helped me? During the early stages of anorexia, my coach encouraged me to come along to training. So like I said before, just keeping involved, and that's eventually how I got into coaching. My coach offered a listening ear. So despite being 6'4" and 107 kilos, he still tried to understand. So eventually I paid for weekly private therapy over a 3-year period to tackle the core issues. So similar to what I said before about how I think there is a need for athlete-specific treatment. I was literally passed around to 10 different psychologists, and at the end I was told that I wasn't trying hard enough, and that was quite a big blow to me. So I think my only option was to pay for private therapy. I think that was why when I was at university as well. But I think that was a major thing that really did help me in the end. Because if I wasn't benefiting from what was being offered, I think it didn't mean that I had to stick with what only was being offered. I think that there's plenty of people out there that you could draw upon for support, so you don't just have to listen to what's meant to be right for you. I think everyone's treatment will be very different. I broadened my sense of identity and coping resources. So instead of just doing sport, I went back to university and I did sports psychology, and straight psychology as well. So Also, I took up photography, so I sometimes do that. Reading, go out with friends more. So it's just trying to broaden what I do and don't just stick to sport. I think that has helped me. The bottom one was it? Yeah, that's quite a big one. I redefined what success and achievement meant to me, both in and out of sport. So I think this can link to some of the risk factors for athletes that develop an eating disorder, because I had very black and white thinking, and I think that can be a trait of some high level athletes where, you know, if you come second then you're rubbish. Like, it's just you need to win. Whereas now I don't view success and achievement as that. I see it more as enjoying what I'm doing, and it doesn't really, yeah, it sucks to lose, but I mean, it's not the most important thing anymore. Yeah, as long as I'm learning from what I'm doing, then that's the most important thing. So I think even that exercise, you can talk to athletes about that, to maybe, if they do have an unhealthy belief around success and failing and fear of failure, then maybe you have that conversation to them. What does success mean to you, or what does losing mean to you? And if there's anything really irrational that comes out of there, then maybe that you can identify them as maybe being at some sort of risk of developing unhealthy attitudes towards sport and exercise and food. So yeah. So takeaway messages. The main one: you don't have to be an expert, a clinical psychologist, a doctor, or have personal experience of an eating disorder to provide support. I think everyone within sport has a role to play. Eating disorders are treatable mental illnesses, so you don't have to suffer from them your whole life. They can be treated. Coaches and support staff have important roles to play, so identifying the disordered eating and eating disorders early and making referrals to the right people. So if it is at disordered level and not at clinical level, then a sports psychologist or psychotherapist, anyone who you think can and will suit the athlete in being someone that they can talk to, that would help the athlete, I think. If it's already at a clinical issue, then obviously refer to the GP or a clinical psychologist that you have contact with, so they can get treatment as soon as possible. Providing valuable ongoing support, that's a big one for athletes. So to make them feel like if they are having to take time away from sport, just so they don't feel like they've been forgotten, like they can still attend training if they want to, and still attend team socials or whatever it is that's happening. Reducing unhealthy sport-specific pressures, so around the unhealthy training environment, any unhelpful messages that are coming across about your body image or the role of food or exercise, so minimising those. Supporting the return to sport, so making sure that any sport-specific pressures that were there that led to the development of an eating disorder are no longer there, or have been reduced to a much healthier level. However, eating disorders are extremely complex issues, so like I said before, it won't be the same experience for everyone, and yeah, there's so many, like there's biological, psychological, social, cultural. There's so many different factors that sometimes it's not just simply one clear-cut issue that led to their development of the illness. It can be a mixture of them, and that can be quite a tough one to for the recovery process, but it's not impossible. So yeah, thank you for joining the webinar. Thank you to Vicky Heighton, who's the founder of the FCN, for organising the webinar. And if there's any questions, then please post in the box. Oh, I think there's some already. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and if I can't answer the questions here, or if I need to send further information, I'll be happy to. So, okay, so you spoke about cardiac abnormalities. Many senior endurance athletes will have a low blood pressure and low heart rate, yeah, as a result of their heart muscle. How are cardiac I think for the abnormalities from malnourishment, I think the main thing they would use was be an ECG. That's one of the first things that they would do. And if there's any abnormalities in the function of the heart, then obviously that would be something to pick up on. Blood tests. So if you have low iron, then obviously that would be an issue. So if the cardiac arrest was actually from very, very low potassium, and being an athlete and having very low potassium from bulimia, that was lethal because you lose potassium when you're exercising. So yeah, so it wasn't a very good combination. So if someone does have bulimia, which is quite severe, then they may need to stop exercising, or else it can have a very negative effect on them. Can they be reversed if normal? I'd say not just the normal body weight. I think just the normal, just normal health in general. So they may need to have a lot of daily supplements. I think if they're eating properly as well, then hopefully they'll get all their supplements from the normal food, rather than vitamins or anything. So yeah, I think it's less about the body weight and more about what it is they're eating and drinking every day. But yeah, it depends on how severe the illness was, whether there is any permanent damage to their heart. But yeah, things can be reversed. The same with osteoporosis. Osteopenia. That can be reversed. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Any more questions? But yeah, if you don't, okay. I think that's really helpful. Do you think there is still a lack of appreciation of the psychological component? Yes, definitely, Elizabeth. I think that a lot of the time, if someone is known to have disordered eating or eating disorder, there's a tendency to focus on what they're eating and maybe refer them to a sports nutritionist. I mean, in the immediate term, I think that can be needed if they need to gain weight, if they're at a dangerously low weight. But I think when they do become a normal weight, the help shouldn't stop. There's obviously a lot of psychological aspects to it, which can end up prolonging the illness, and not just the psychological factors that made them develop the illness, but I think the psychological factors that have come since the illness, because I think at the time, if you struggled for a long time, it can impact your whole life. And you may, so for me, I didn't have depression before my eating disorder. I got depression after a few years of having an eating disorder because it impacted everything. So yeah, and I think when you have more than one diagnosis as well, you can end up being passed between different teams. So when I had bulimia and then I had depression, I would be, first I went to the eating disorder team, and then the eating disorder team said that's a depression issue. So then I was referred to the depression team, and then kind of referred back. So it's like there needs to be more collaboration, and I think that I think sport would be a great environment for that, because then with an multidisciplinary team, to stay in Leicester City. There's a whole team that can communicate very well with each other. So yeah. Thank you, Vicky. We need to open around all this. What about the comorbid aspects? Oh yeah, I just yeah. So yeah, I used to describe actually anorexia as very similar to OCD, because it's like if you don't exercise or you don't eat very little amounts of food, it just sticks in your head, and it's like you can't function unless you've done what the sort of thoughts are telling you to do. But yeah, it can. I think eating disorders rarely come on their own. I mean, they can, but yeah, it can come with depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder. There's so many different things, and it can make treatment very hard. But I think it is getting better. So yeah, I hope that answers. Is there any research definitely linked with subsequent problems? Claire, that's a very good question actually. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll try and post some information about that if that would help. So I do know people that have had anorexia and they haven't ever had a period, and they can't have children. But I mean, it's very individualized. It depends how long you've had the illness for, how low your body weight was and your body fat was. So I don't think it's clear cut. I don't think it's the same answer for everyone. But yeah, so I think that there is medication that can help. I think Bobby Clay is on given some hormones, and now she's got her period, so that's great news, and I think that can be a very good thing. But that they can only do that if you know that an athlete hasn't got their period. So yeah, I think just more awareness and more talking about it is one of the best things that you can do. But I'll try and post some research about that, because I think that's a good thing to promote actually. Yeah, so thank you. Maybe a silly question. Hi, Louise. Is food intake restriction the same as anorexia? Food intake restriction. No, no. So anorexia is very. So it's not just the lack of food intake for anorexia. So you have to be less than 85% of your expected weight. They have to have all the different. I can't remember off the top of my head now. The Lanugo. You have to make all of. You have to have, I think, five out of 7 or something like that to be diagnosed with anorexia. So, I mean, food intake restriction will probably be more within disordered eating. But yeah, it can be anorexia as well. I think it's one part of many different factors. Exercise disorder. So I think this has been sometimes termed as anorexia athletica, but I don't think that's in the DSM, which is the manual for diagnosing mental illnesses. But exercise, you can be addicted to exercise in both anorexia and bulimia. So with bulimia, you can binge on large amounts of food and not engage in self-induced vomiting. You can purge by exercising excessively. So that's where that would fit in with the bulimia. And with exercise in anorexia, you would so when I was on the ward, there would be girls and guys walking just up and down constantly along the corridor. But that's part of the illness. It's part of what it makes you do. You can't sit still for long periods of time because you want to burn calories. So yeah, I hope that helps. Oh, can you also? Yeah. I think we can send copies of the slides out. That'll be fine. Yeah, you can share. You can share them. That's fine. A couple of positive messages also can also be reversed if. Oh, yeah, that's true. Thank you. Another risk, dangerously low sodium. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, with the salt levels actually, there was one thing on the ward there. They call it water loading. So say if you get weighed twice a week in the morning. So in the mornings, if you get weighed at 6 a.m. at 5 a.m., there'd be girls who would down 2 litres of water because 2 litres is 2 kilos. So they would appear that they've gained 2 kilos. But it was very, very dangerous because the salt level would decrease dramatically, and it can have an impact on their general health. So I think that that could be actually another sign. So if you know an athlete who drinks loads of water, just to suppress their appetite. I think coffee is another one actually. Drinking lots of coffee and tea rather than actually eating. I think that's another one where you suppress your appetite. Yeah, and it needs to definitely be looked at. This is Stacey Sims. I'll have to look her up. Stacey Sims. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Rachel. When you're receiving inpatient treatment, did you find it beneficial or not being surrounded by other individuals? Oh, I think the first time, because I was twice, the first time I would say it didn't really help me. I was in there for 6 months for that one as well. I went in for bulimia, even though I had anorexia in the past, but specifically for bulimia on that one. And everyone else had anorexia. And obviously I would see a lot of the unhealthy behaviour, so excessive exercise, walking up and down the ward, just a constant focus on food. We would have the cooking channels on the TV throughout the whole day, and where you just sit and like your leg would twitch. That one all the time. That would be quite uncomfortable. So luckily I didn't pick up on many of the behaviours myself. I think in the beginning I did, but then I realised what was happening. Then the second time I went in, I found it a lot more helpful because I thought I was at a better place. I was a better place in my own recovery. I was more willing to engage with the therapists that were on the ward, and I was just more knowing of what I wanted at that time. I think I realised I was competing more in my powerlifting in my second admission just before I went in, and I wanted to return to sport a lot more, and that helped me. Even though we couldn't exercise, but I knew that if I went through this period of treatment and got myself well, I knew that I could exercise in the future when I would get weekend release to go home and things like that. But yeah, outpatient I needed inpatient treatment because outpatient treatment it wasn't working at all. The bulimia was so severe that I a lot of the time for days I wouldn't leave my room or leave the house. I couldn't function at all. And I think many medical professionals will push for outpatient treatment for as long as they can because they want you to be in the environment. They want you to be with family, but if it's not helping, it's not helping. And you need that's when you need inpatient treatment to break the cycle. And but it's harder because sometimes it's dependent on your BMI and your weight. So they might say you might go to the GP and they would say that your weight isn't low enough, and they send you away. And that has happened to me quite a few times, and I literally had to beg to get treatment for my bulimia. because my BMI wasn't low enough. So I had to put it took months for me to put a case forward for them to actually begin to listen to me. And that was an effort in itself because I was so ill and I couldn't really, I had to fight for myself to get help. I think there is that issue as well that you don't, especially with bulimia, you don't have to be at a low weight to have it be severe. So there could be many athletes competing right at the moment they look very normal, but they could be doing such severe harm to themselves inside. But because they're a normal weight, it's not so obvious to coaches and everyone else. So I think with anorexia, because you are a bit lower weight, you're less than 85% of what you're meant to be, it can be a bit easier to spot. But with bulimia, it's not as easy. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so I think yeah, oh, that's okay. Thank you, Louise. Will you be doing? Yes, I will. Yeah, so I'll be in Edinburgh on Friday evening. So I'll be talking about. I'll do a similar talk to this. Probably have some videos and stuff, but I can always share them. I can share them online. But yeah, I'll be there. So. Yeah. Oh no, that's cool. Yeah, I know you won't be nosy. I mean, I hope it helped. No, I think it will be recorded, but I don't know whether it'll be posted online. But I'll check. I'll definitely check, and then I'll let you know. I don't think it's being streamed, but yeah, I think it's been recorded. But yeah, so thank you everyone. If you have any more questions, then feel free to contact me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and I'll do my best to respond to them, and I'll try and post research. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you. Thinking of early intervention. Okay, so I'll read the questions out. Thinking of early intervention, the key slide for me was that which compared the good athlete attributes and those of an athlete susceptible to disordered eating and eating disorders. Where does the disordered eating scale start? If I go back to, oh, is it not going? Oh, okay. Nope. So I think was it that one? Okay, so healthy attitudes obviously be on the left-hand side, and so disordered eating is anything in the middle. So it's the yo-yo dieting, excessive exercise, weight and shape, preoccupation, fasting, compulsive overeating. Let me go back to the question. Yeah, it is. I probably won't have a definitive answer to that. It is a very fine line, I think, and I think even healthy athletes with healthy attitudes and behaviours towards exercise and food will sometimes slide into disordered eating at times, but then they'll slide back, so they won't stay in there for a very long time. I think, so say if an athlete has an injury, they may slide down that scale, but they have the adequate support and resources to move them back out of it. So yeah, so I've got my loss of train of thought there. Yeah, so it's kind of monitoring the, next slide. Next slide. No, keep going. That one? Yeah, okay. So yeah, so the similarities are very yeah, they're very similar. So competitive personality traits and perfectionistic tendencies Yeah, so I think I put that slide in there just to show that it is extremely difficult to say that yes, this athlete will get an eating disorder and this one won't, because all good athletes will have very similar characteristics to someone who is a massive so all good athletes have very similar characteristics to someone who has very severe anorexia. So it's very, very hard to distinguish the two and say this one will and this one won't. I think it depends much more on the issue, the reasons behind it, and the other risk factors, rather than saying these are the qualities. And yeah, I hope I'm making sense. I don't. Oh, we go up. Oh, how do I scroll? Oops. Sorry. Any prospects in the slides? Oh yeah, I'm sure we can get the slides out. I think that would be okay. Do you have any further sport-specific references for recommended treatment? In my experience, it's a lifelong problem. Do you consider it something you would always keep an eye on? First, I'll look for the references and I can get them out to you. If I just get Vicky, if I can get the email address, that'd be great. So yeah, in my experience, it is, for me, it is a lifelong issue. I mean, most recently, I think it's during times of stress where it can be an issue. So recently, my coach has been very, very unwell, and I found myself not wanting to eat anymore. But I think I'm more aware of the early warning signs and how I can get back on track. Whereas previously, when I was younger, I wasn't that aware. I was still in the early stages of recovery. Well, I wouldn't. I use the word recovery, but I don't. To me, it's going to sound quite pessimistic. I don't think recovery it exists. It isn't a set time that you get to. I think you can only really manage it, and I think that's either within sport or without sport. You've got to decide for yourself. I think no matter if your coach wants you to stay in sport, but you can't do it, then you have to do what's best for you. And I think for me in athletics, I wasn't enjoying competing anymore, so I decided to take on more of a coaching role and only compete if I have to. And I found that made me put less pressure on myself. Yeah, and I just managed to enjoy it more. I think just yeah, it can be a lifelong issue. But if it's caught early, then it might not be for others. So I think it just depends on the individual, I think. Combination. Thank you, Claire. Can you add something regarding combination of academic pressures with stresses? Let me see. I think that so with any eating disorder, I think that someone who is going to get and suffer from an eating disorder, it will potentially come out under stress and a huge amount of stress. And I think that with athletes, it just comes out within a sporting context. So with others who aren't athletes, it would come out when they're suffering a bereavement or a divorce or something similar. Yeah, so I think it is, for me, it was during year 11 when I was starting my GCSEs, and the combination of going up an age group as well. And I think maybe if the age group was a different one, or if I just had one of those, maybe it wouldn't have been the trigger, but then it would have been triggered further on down the line, I think. So I think it also depends what kind of school you go to as well. how supportive the teachers are, how supportive the parents are. So I think eating disorders are so complex that there's no one answer for it, but there is a combination that can be really successful and helpful for the athlete. So I hope that helps. Thanks, Al. To whom should a coach refer an athlete who has requested help? Okay, so if you know an athlete that really does want to get better and help with an eating disorder, the first thing would be to refer to their GP and their doctor, just so they can get monitored physically and they can be referred. However, if you, I mean, do that one, but then if you're looking for clinical psychology help and a sports psychology help, that it would be great to have both, because clinical psychologists can do their work and then the sports psychology can target the actual sport specific pressures. And I think they do have the ability to communicate with each other. And I think that's really important. I think some people think that you have to be either a clinical psychologist can help you or a sports psychologist, but it's definitely a combination of the two would be the best. I think the more support, the better. So I think also Dr. John R. Kellis is probably a great one to go to. He's done a lot of work with athletes. There probably are more out there around the London area if you're down there, or could be some in Scotland. I'll have to have a look. Yeah, I hope that helps. Thank you so much. Thanks, Judith. How do you best manage an athlete who is demonstrating eating disorder behaviours but denies having a problem? That is quite hard. I think athletes will deny the issue initially, because that's the nature of the disorder. They don't want to be found out, so they will try and hide it. Like that. Yeah, they will try and hide it as much as they can. I think. Well, let me go to the slide where it has the. Sorry, I'll get there. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so I think this could potentially help in showing the athlete that maybe they do have an issue. Because if you do, I think it's a similar thing for when you're trying to develop confidence in an athlete, that you use their training program to show them that this is how much work you've done, and it gives them a bit of confidence when they look back over it. So in this context, if an athlete cannot see that it is an issue, then they can see that actually it is actually having a big impact on their performance. And I think most athletes do want to perform well, so it can be a good way to kind of make them realize that it is having an impact and they cannot continue to do this for forever. And I think what helped me a lot was I didn't really know anyone who had an eating disorder as an athlete, so I didn't really have anyone to talk to, but I read a lot of books of people who had, not just athletes, just normal people who had eating disorders, and that helped a lot, because I could relate to their story, and then because I could relate to them, then it made me realise that, okay, maybe I do have this issue. Because I remembered when I first realised that I developed bulimia, I didn't really know what bulimia was, but I was Googling some of my symptoms, and I realised that, okay, like I read some stories of people who had it, and I was experiencing exactly the same as them. So it did make me realise that, okay, maybe I do have an issue, and I do have to face it. So hopefully that will help them realise. I think if you keep relating it back to performance and back to how the sooner they can target the issues, the sooner they can get back to performing well. I think that's good.